Here is James Carville. Carville. And I think this was right after he had said, we got to fire Tom Perez. I don't know what the hell he's doing.
I remember he had a great line during remember the BP oil spill? Like in 2010?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and he said when Obama was Obama was very low key on that, and Carville said that FDR would have jumped out of his wheelchair to get into the Gulf and go after BP. Yeah.
Now, I think Carville believes what he's saying here. I mean, I also think that he is. I think he's wrong. I think he believes what he's saying here. I don't know that he has a particular dog in this fight. I don't know. He was talking that he's an old man, but here, you decide.
A lot of people compare him to Jeremy Corbyn. I say he might be closer to Lopez Obrador in Mexico, somebody who manages to get in the power.
Here's just ironically enough, here is Jason Johnson now defending Bernie Sanders.
What's his deal?
I don't know. We'll see what he says about Obrador.
Well,
I wonder where this is going.
Carville says before this, he says, I'm afraid we got Jeremy Corbyn, and we should have learned the lesson. We don't want to be the Labor Party here because they just got licked.
Right.
But Jason Johnson has a different theory as to who Sanders represents in this context.
Which that Sanders could win, but then he's going to say that Obrador is oligarchic.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Autocratic or some
I
nonsense.
Might have
anyway,
different association with it than he does.
Corbyn. I say he might be closer to Lopez Obrador in Mexico, somebody who manages to get into power because the existing parties have so disappointed everybody. People are disgusted with Democrats. They don't trust Republicans. They go for Bernie. Do you think that is a path to victory if he makes that argument?
Why do I think people are disgusted with Democrats? We had the highest turnout in 2018 since women were granted the right to vote. We had the biggest margin. We ran a smart campaign, and it worked. All right? It matters who the candidate is. It matters what a party chooses to talk about. I mean, I'm 75 years old. Why am I here doing this? Because I am scared to death. That's why. And let's get relevant here, people, for sure.
Okay.
That's why I don't Lopez Obrador. All the Sanders people were taking pictures wishing Jeremy Corbyn the best.
Oh, and they were mistaken. They were very mistaken, yes.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down that path.
Okay, all I've got for you, James, is Claire. I just love you.
I love you too, and your analysis. If you look at the press corps went AOC crazy in the Iowa caucuses of liberal, it's too whatever. To combine the left side of the party, and I don't consider myself a liberal, by the way. I'm not a moderate, but they Senator Klobuchar and Buttigieg got a lot of votes. And we got to decide what we want to be. Do we want to be an ideological cult, or do we want to have a majoritarian instinct to be a majority party? I know where you stand on that, Senator, because you had to run in a red state.
Right.
So, and again, you and I know that 18% of the country elects 52 senators. And the urban core is not going to get it done. What we need is power. You understand? That's what this is about. Without power, you have nothing. Yep. You just have talking points. In the Marine Corps, they say, wish in one hand and do something in the other. Which hand is going to fill up the fastest? we better get serious here. And, a lot of Democrats around the country are concerned.
I don't disagree with everything he's saying.
Well, I think the broad strokes.
Character.
I think his one in the midterm elections. I think what was driving people to a large extent was a disdain of Trump, and to the extent that there was any campaign run by the Democrats, it was around healthcare. Now, I do think that there is value in framing an argument for Medicare for all as an extension of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think that's quite accurate, frankly, but it is if you look at specifically like Medicaid. We want to take the part of the Affordable Care Act that expanded Medicaid, and we want to up its game into Medicare and provide it for everybody. But the Democrats ran on protecting health care for, that was probably the most consistent thing that each congressional candidate ran on, was protecting healthcare. And to the extent that it wasn't Trump and just sort of negative partisanship that drove people out. And I think that's where the failure is of his analysis. Now, with that said, he also said, like, he doesn't like any of the candidates. But
I think that his point, first in the beginning about, I don't know about the Democrats being popular. And I think, frankly, in the general election, we might hear, if they're smart, a little bit less about socialism, which I will miss, but it's fine. And a little bit more about being an independent, which I think could play extremely well in
that's
general election.
That's what Johnson was saying.
Yeah, no. Actually, Johnson's Obrador point, I think, was on point. I think that's a much closer analogy, frankly. The one thing I do think about Carville, which I think people are going to need to start to think about, and, it shows up with, I don't want to reopen it, but the Joe Rogan thing's an obvious example, is like, this is not just about signaling to and catering to like a specific crowd. It's about building out and actually winning. And I wish there were more people, with some of that instinct in, frankly, like the socialist and left orbit, because it's really important. Because at the end of the day, he's right. If you don't get power, it doesn't really matter. And that was part of some of the breakdown. To the extent that labor could control anything in the UK, and I don't think they could mostly control it, it was complete propaganda war. I think at times there was a little bit of like some sense of like, oh, well, we'll lose, but we'll make the point. Well, forget it.
He's right about needing power, but he's wrong about how we get the power. And he's making the same mistake that the Democrats have made forever, which is pandering to this mythical moderate who is ideologically in the center of the political spectrum.
That's not really true in his case.
Doesn't support things like Medicare. Medicare for all is incredibly popular. People might not say, oh, I identify with socialism, but if you poll them, does everybody need health care? They'll say yes. Like the electorate is a bundle of contradictions, and
I don't think the polling is so.
Democrats think that they're conservative.
Carville is
when
closer to appealing to where the electorate is actually at in his career, which is why he's one of the people who's interesting to talk to. So he is. Whatever. This doesn't make him look bad at all. I met him once in some green room, and he literally, this is like way before Bernie was on the map, and obviously he's really tight with the Clintons, and he was just like, what Mrs. Clinton needs to do is needs to show that she'll go after those Wall Street motherfuckers. Now, whatever you think of, obviously, I don't believe she would ever do that for a variety of reasons. But I'm saying, and you look back at the 92 campaign he designed for Bill Clinton, it was a fusion, including of some things were appalling, like overt appeals to naked racism. Like that's what Greenberg and him, in my opinion, cooked up. But it was a lot of talk about not single payer, but taking on the banks, national health care, investing in people. So he's someone who actually, his trajectory is more of that economically populist, socially moderate thing, which is where there is a center. Like to the extent there's a center, that is where it is.
Medicare for all, it is not, the polling is not terribly clear on this. So if you go, there was a poll by the Kaiser Foundation, which is a fairly, I think, reputable polling outfit in terms of this stuff. As Medicare for all becomes a staple in national conversations, they go on to say that it depends on how you ask the question.
No crap.
What's that?
Yeah, of course.
Well, of course. And so it's not clear that Donald Trump won't be able to message, or the Republicans won't be able to message better than the Democrats. It's unclear, right? We don't know.
But Carville's a guy who's not saying run against Trump on cutting the deficit and on, social
Absolutely.
equity. He's saying you go up against Trump on corporate tax cuts and remind people that you like police.
Well, I think
which is frankly, that is where a lot of people are at. So we got to be strategically sound about this.
The things that he said in that same interview, I watched it live, was he said, you're going to go out there and you're going to talk about prisoners getting the vote, or you're going to talk about providing health care to undocumented immigrants, you're going to lose.
Yep.
And that's
what needs to be overcome. And that's a real thing he's identifying.
This polling also finds more Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents would prefer voting for a candidate who wants to build on the ACA in order to expand coverage and reduce costs rather than replace the ACA with a Medicare for all plan. Now, I mean, look, so much of this is about messaging, and so much is it about moving it in a certain direction. And I'm not even convinced that even though you can look at this polling, that broadly speaking, the idea of just sort of strong and wrong doesn't necessarily sway more votes with people. I'm just saying that I don't think it's accurate to say that it's a slam dunk that Medicare for All is more popular with people. It really depends on how you ask the question, relative to what, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean that deployed in the right hands, it can't be more effective than another proposal that people perceive is wishy-washy. Because again, I do think that particularly in this era, people value a certain amount of frankness from their candidate over maybe the specific ideas.
I think that's how Bernie does get away with the felons voting thing, which again, I completely agree with. Trump will demonize him on it. And I think the way Bernie specifically gets away with it goes back to the Rogan clip. The dude says what he thinks, and he said it for decades, and that will have some salutary effect. But as a general message, I think people do need to be more prepared, not on policy, but on signifying to people, in a general election, I love the troops. There's a border. They're gonna have to do a lot of stuff like that, of course.
And as long as he doesn't waver on policy, I think that will be fine.
Yeah, I mean, he may not even have the opportunity to waver on policy. I mean, who knows?
I don't think. A lot of it isn't policy.
That's been the dividing line when we talk about a lot of this culture war stuff, and when we were talking about the Rogan stuff. I mean, Bernie's not changing his policy platform on transgender rights. He's not changing his policy platform on.
The concern with that is it's the flip side of what is the selling point of Sanders, right? The idea is that he's going to refashion the electorate in such a way that it's going to make a legislative agenda easier, because he's going to bring in certain members of a coalition that are going to influence lawmakers, right? That's the argument with Sanders, right? I mean, that's how the powers. Well, it cuts the other way too. Because if you're going to bring in X amount of people because they're going to be more interested in material gains, and therefore they're going to pressure Joe Manchin, let's say, in West Virginia as an example, to get Medicare for All, those people are also going to come in with another whole set of policies that may not be that. I mean, theoretically, that's the argument that the people are making. Is not that Sanders is necessarily, changing his agenda to fit what Joe Rogan wants, but that in the same way that supposedly Sanders is going to create a different electorate that's going to pressure their lawmakers, they're not just coming in with stuff that we like.
Let me just say real quick, though.
That may, go against it. That's the argument.
I want to say, first of all, just to be fair, Rogan definitely on actual legal issues, which are at the end of the day is what we're actually talking about, does support.
Yes.
Okay, so that's really important.
But just the other day was talking about how transgender kids shouldn't be able to get gender-affirming care. That's policy.
But in addition to that,
they don't.
But
3-year-olds don't. That's also the reality, is that none of that, you don't get any of those type of therapy until you start going through.
No, I mean, the most that you would give to an underage kid is puberty blockers.
Well, that's what I'm saying. He was talking about 3-year-olds.
But he was talking about how you shouldn't be able to give puberty blockers to transgender teens.
But the other other really important point here, though, is that if the people who are making that point, if they're right, then there's political persuasion and all aspects of political science and the labor movement and any number of positive lessons we've learned. And the only possibility of recreating some type of durable electorate, and the Adolph Reed project and the Baird Rustin project is done, right? The idea is that on one hand, you have a broad enough coalition where you're not going to be able to mandate everybody's social etiquette and how they talk or how everybody's personal beliefs are. And I don't think you should try to. But on the other hand, when it comes to substantive matters of rights and equity, that working in shared undertakings and shared endeavors has a positive effect. Yeah. And frankly, I think you even already see that with some of the response, to Bernie reaching out to these broader electorates. So I see a lot of people who make that argument. I see people who just want to be in a clubhouse. I don't see them wanting to actually win or really change anything. And even when Obama, when he signed the executive order and when he followed the lead of the Supreme Court on marriage equity, inside his coalition, the rates of support for transgender rights and marriage equity went up. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
You don't do it by isolating and demagoguing.
Yeah, well, it's analogous to like people in the labor movement changing their attitudes on race after working together with workers of different races for a shared cause, for common interests. Like so much of the time, this is how these kinds of bigotries, right, that are not based in rationality, you can't always talk people out of it because it's not rational in the first place. That's how these attitudes change. They change with a sense of shared purpose and linked fate.
Let's go to the IMs.